Hey everybody, this episode of the podcast is being sponsored by my friends over at Real Mushrooms, my friend Jeff Chilton and his son Sky. I interviewed Jeff on one of the earlier episodes of this podcast. Really happy that they're sponsoring this podcast. They sell medicinal mushrooms, things like reishi, chaga, lion's mane, turkey tail, cordyceps. I think more and more people are becoming familiar with the truly amazing benefits of medicinal mushrooms on our physical, our mental, even our spiritual well-being. They're an amazing company. They're one of the few, if any, companies that's not only 100% organic, but 100% mushrooms, and that's really rare. A lot of companies have fillers or additives, or also important, it's not the mycelium that's grown on grain and mixed together, it's the actual mushroom, and that's a really rare thing. It's a really pure product. It's the only product, the medicinal mushroom product that I take. Super happy with them, super happy that they're sponsoring this podcast. If you'd like more information about them, you can check out their website at realmushrooms.com/universe to also receive 25% off of your first order. On this episode of the podcast, I sat down with Adrian Freedman. Adrian's a really interesting guy. I found out about him through, I believe, a music festival in Portugal. We also share some mutual friends. He's had a really fascinating life. He's a musician by trade. He grew up with the love of music. He was classically trained. At one point, he ended up finding or discovering the Shakuhachi, which is a very beautiful Japanese flute, and that led him to Japan, where he lived, I think, for something like 8 years, going very deeply into that practice. Eventually, he found the Santo Daime community, the big Brazilian ayahuasca church, and that really opened a whole nother trajectory for him. He was also studying Buddhism. So we talked about all of these subjects of music, of ayahuasca, of Buddhism, of plant medicine, and really I think how music is a thread line in all of these, and how music really connects and opens us in the world of plant medicine. So he's a really interesting guy. He's been walking this journey for a long time, I think more than 30 years now. So I really enjoyed sitting down and learning from him, and I trust you all will gain a lot from this conversation. If you're interested in working with myself and my colleague Marav Artsy, I believe when this comes out, we will still have one more plant dieta that will be in the Sacred Valley of Peru beginning November 2nd to the 30th. If you'd like more information about that, you can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And then finally, as always, if you're able to help with the algorithms, it's a really big help. So if you're viewing this on YouTube or Rumble, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a star rating and a short review. And finally, if you're able to support this podcast via Patreon, that's a really big help. As always, thank you to all the patrons who are supporting that way. It's a really great website. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for. Those tiers also give you different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. I really like the idea of websites like that because they're based off this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, that's an amazing way to give back. So that's it for the intro. Thank you all for tuning in. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Adrian. Of spiritual traditions around the world, music is a big part, but I think maybe more in a modern context, we often don't associate music with spirituality. I mean, if you open Spotify or something in general, I don't think people are looking at it in terms of spirituality. In the same way, if you go to church, there's very often not music, and so we just tend to compartmentalize things, I think, but often in traditional practices around the world, I mean, from my understanding, like the Shakuhachi, it's tied to Zen and Buddhism, and as I'm sure we'll talk about, this more plant medicine or plant spirit path, usually music is a fundamental part of it. I spent a long time with a group of people called the Shipibo Kanibo people in the Peruvian Amazon, and one of the things I really liked about their way of working is it's very simple. Like often, and sometimes these plant medicine ways of working, like I spent a good amount of time in the Andes too, and there's often these very elaborate altars and objects and things, and it's very beautiful too. But there's something about the simplicity of the Shipibo that I felt with how they worked, and they basically had 3 tools. They had their tobacco, their pipe, they had their perfume, and they had their song. And probably of all of those, their song was their main tool. And so it was really seen as a fundamental part of their healing. That medicine path was the song, was the music. So I always think it's really interesting, and I think it's something in this podcast, probably I haven't gone into a lot of depth in, is like the actual musical element, the singing element, the sound, the vibration, the resonance, all of these things. So really, really honored to have you here. Maybe just to start, if you can speak a bit about your background. You know, it's always a big question, but who you are, where you come from, and kind of your journey that brought you to music, to plants, to kind of the journey that you're on.
Mm-hmm. I'm someone that was always drawn to music from a very young age. My earliest memory of any significance was my first day at school when there was a piano in the room, and they couldn't keep me off the piano. And after a few weeks, the teacher said to my mom, "Maybe you should give him lessons." So that's what started. I started lessons when I was very young on the piano, and then when I was 7, I started playing the violin. And when I was 9 years old, I became obsessed by the trumpet. I would see the TV program about Louis Armstrong. I think he just passed away, and there was some program on the TV. And we didn't have a TV in our house, so watching the TV was already something. And then seeing this guy playing the trumpet, it just sparked something in me. So I became a trumpet player, and all through school and high school and college, I was studying trumpet and piano. And when I got to music college, I was just very, very curious about all kinds of music. So I became interested in medieval and Renaissance Baroque music, also avant-garde, contemporary music. And in those days, the genre that we now know as world music didn't exist. If you wanted to hear music from Nigeria or from Korea or from Chile, you'd have to seek out the recordings in ethnomusicological departments of university libraries. You wouldn't hear it on the radio, you wouldn't hear concerts of these things, and there wasn't any internet. There were some specialized record stores. And so after exploring jazz music and classical music and folk music and contemporary music, I found myself really drawn to these exotic sounds of other cultures. And it was when I first heard the Japanese shakuhachi. I was in my sort of mid-20s, I guess, and I'd already spent all the years of my life fully immersed in music and playing so many instruments. When I first heard the shakuhachi flute, the Japanese bamboo flute, it just immediately kind of struck some very special place within me. It's a very unique sound, and it was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, but somehow it also felt kind of familiar, like it was calling some part of me. And I wanted to learn the instruments. The place where I first heard it was actually a free jazz club in London that I was a member of. And people used to show up with all kinds of instruments and play free improvised music. And one of the people who was a member of that group, Clive Bell, he played the shakuhachi. And so that's where I first heard it. And I asked him if he'd teach me a short while later. And so he started teaching me, he helped me to find an instrument, which was a whole thing in itself in those days. And after a while, I realized that what I really wanted to learn was the Japanese music, the really traditional, authentic Japanese pieces that come from Zen Buddhist tradition and are hundreds of years old. And Clive was unable to teach me that music. So it became clear I needed to go to Japan. And I didn't know anything about Japan. I didn't know any Japanese people or Japanese language. I didn't know anything about it. I'd never felt drawn to Japan. But the instrument took me there. And I was very fortunate that by a series of chance happenings, I found an exceptional teacher, the very venerated master, Yokoyama Katsuye. And I stayed there for 8 years and became very deeply immersed in it, intensive practice of this instrument. I continued to play other instruments, and I was working as a composer because that was what I studied at university. So I was writing music for theatre groups and dance groups and different kinds of projects, and also working with electronic music instruments, not dance music, but more the early days of sampling to create soundscapes for soundtracks for dance, contemporary dance. And but the Shakuhachi was leading me in another direction, because throughout the whole of this journey, since I was 5 years old, the thing that drew me to music was the sound and the color and the textures and the rhythms, different instruments, different kinds of music, this infinite sea of possibility of sound. And through the Shakuhachi, I was introduced to a completely different aspect of music, which is the spiritual subculture. And the Shakuhachi comes from a very particular tradition. There was, in Japan, there are different schools of Buddhism. One of the main schools is Zen Buddhism. And then within the Zen Buddhist school, there are also many small schools, like you find in a lot of villages. And one of the schools of Buddhism, of Zen Buddhism, is the Fuke school. And all of the monks of this tradition would play the shakuhachi as part of their Nendiraja's house. And they would use the practice of breath and sound to cultivate a certain kind of awareness. And the music was seen as a portal. So rather than creating music simply to create beautiful sounds, the music itself, in a way, is secondary to the silence that followed, or the silence between the notes. If you and I were to sit in this room now and just be very quiet and experience silence, that's one kind of silence. But the shakuhachi is designed, the music of the shakuhachi is designed and evolved in such a way that when the music dies away, your ears, both your outer ear and more importantly your inner ear, are opened to perceive the silence in a totally different way. And there are other aspects of the meditation tradition that are also woven into this practice. Because, for example, someone who's not meditated before might see somebody meditating, it looks very peaceful. Somebody sitting in the posture of the Buddha without moving, a peaceful expression on their face. And you could imagine that meditation is associated with being in a peaceful state. Where actually, as anyone who's ever tried to meditate knows, once you sit down and you try to be peaceful and stop all your thoughts, the opposite happens. You become immediately aware of all the thoughts rushing through your mind, not any discomfort in your body, or images, memories arising, all kinds of things pulling you away from that space of stillness. And so the music expresses that as well. It reflects and illustrates all the different levels of meditation, from that kind of turmoil that we experience when we feel we're being pulled by wild horses in different directions, to the moments of complete peace and tranquility and insight. And so my personal journey evolved from being one of a musician, curious about musical instruments and different musical styles, to somebody that also was curious and engaged with spiritual practice. And then later, after I'd been living in Japan for a number of years, I met some people from Brazil who were traveling in Japan with ayahuasca, in plant spirit medicine ceremonies. And I had no interest in this at the time. I was not really aware of it. I had no interest in shamanism or South America or ritual ceremonies of that kind. I was not really also interested or aware of the whole field of healing, self-transformational healing, because spiritual practice can have a very refined aspect to it, and focusing on almost philosophical concepts in the Buddhist context, thinking about impermanence and interdependence of things. But at the root of the Buddhist teachings is an awareness of suffering, what they call dukkha, And the foundation of all the Buddha's teachings is based on what he called the Four Noble Truths. And the first one of those is suffering exists. So the spiritual practice of Buddhism leads you from the very outset to confront whatever suffering you're carrying, which could be of a personal nature, or it could be transgenerational, it could be collective. And so the next step on from that naturally would be through confronting and exploring the pathways to alleviating whatever suffering you're carrying, it leads to a journey of healing. And that was the next step from spiritual practice to healing. And at the time when I met these Brazilian people that were working with ayahuasca, it was a time in my life when I was actually going through kind of what you might call the dark night of the soul, my kind of devotional breakdown of some kind. I didn't really know what was happening to it. I have really no way of understanding it. But it just happened to coincide with the first ayahuasca session that I did, which I also fell into kind of an accident, because these Brazilian people were staying with friends of mine, and they called me up and said, "Why do you come around and meet these guys, bring their instruments?" So I met these guys, and I just fell in love with them, with their energy. With Brazilian guys singing, telling stories, and I just loved the songs they were singing and everything about them. So when they said, "Hey, you're going to come and play music with us in the ceremony this weekend," I was like, "Sure." The next thing I know, I'm in a Santo Daime session in the line to receive a cup of ayahuasca. And then I had a most extraordinary experience, which was totally unexpected, because I just felt my heart cracking open. And I just became aware of so much stuff that I was carrying that I hadn't been aware of. And I tried to tell myself, "Oh, this is just because you've taken this mind-altering drug. It's not real." But I knew it was something authentic, because it was something within me that I was being able to feel for the first time. I was being shown things I hadn't seen before. And so from being a musician interested in music to being someone interested in spiritual practice, it then became somebody committed to a healing path. And that led me to a very deep immersion into Brazilian spiritual practices with ayahuasca. And then I became a facilitator myself. This was all happening a long time ago, because the first session I did was 30 years ago. And now I find myself in a place where I'm facilitating a lot of sessions and traveling around the world, the groups, receiving my own medicine songs, engaging with a lot of musicians on collaborative projects. And those three aspects of my life are still very much alive, and still very much in the process of ongoing evolution. And it's a never-ending journey, the journey of healing, the journey of spiritual practice, and the journey of musical expression.
So kind of going back to your childhood and your education, I think a lot of people obviously feel a connection to music. Like I mentioned, Spotify, it's a huge business now. Stock is doing very well. So obviously they have a big user base. Even a lot of people maybe dabble in music, play music, but not so many people, I think, get formal training in music. What is that like? I mean, can you describe that to maybe people who haven't gone through that training? Like, obviously people understand music, like you listen to a song, or you have some understanding that there's maybe sounds and vibrations and instruments and maybe words, lyrics, but I don't think maybe a lot of people understand kind of maybe a structure or root or a tradition of like what's being taught. I think a lot of people also think, and I think we'll get to this kind of this inspiration aspect of music, but looking at it more from that place of learning, like going to the school, having a foundation. Like what are you taught? How are you taught to look at music, to view music, to understand music, to begin to work and produce music?
It's a very good question. When I went to music university in 1980, there was quite a difference in those days between, I don't know, maybe still the same now, between going to university to study music and going to college. Going to music college was very practical based, so you'd learn musical instruments basically, you'd learn how to play different styles of music depending on what kind of college it was. Whereas the university education was more intellectual, looking at the history of music and how it evolved through different harmonic styles over the centuries, the history of Western music. And also as a composer, learning the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of music, how it actually fits together. One important aspect of the formal training that I had that goes beyond any intellectual pursuit or any learning of the musical instrument is the development of the musical ear, which is very fascinating. So, for example, me and my fellow students, we would sit in a hall. Each person would have a table and a piece of music paper and a pencil, and the lecturer would put on a piece of music, and we would have to write down what we could hear. Now, in one sense, this could be a very simple act. If I was singing a little melody, you could figure out what those notes are if you had some basic training. But we would have to listen to a string quartet with 4 instruments and write down as much as we could hear of all the parts, all the inner parts, and then going on to more and more complicated pieces so that you're listening to a symphony with bassoons and trombones and violins and violas and all different kinds of instruments. And you have to write down everything you can hear. And this is a process of training the inner ear. It's something I became very grateful for in later life, because it gives you an insight into what's actually happening within the music. At the same time as saying this, some of the very best musicians, especially in the popular music world, the Beatles are an absolute classic example, because Paul McCartney is still going strong. There's many documentaries you can watch of him talking about his music, and he doesn't even read music. He doesn't even know the names of the chord. Well, I guess he knows the names of the chorus, but he has a very rudimentary technical understanding of music, and yet the music just flows out of him in a very sophisticated way. So there are advantages and disadvantages to this. I've been in sessions. I worked as a session musician for some time. And some of the very best session musicians also have no musical education. And I've been around classical musicians who are very highly trained, who are not in touch with their own inner musical flow, and they can only play music that's written down for them to play. So there are different sides to this. But I was very fascinated by the harmonic language of music, which has evolved in the same way as the visual language of painting has evolved, from cave paintings through to figurative paintings and then to abstract model art. And music had a similar journey from simple melodies to more sophisticated harmonic structures, to the point where avant-garde music started to break all the rules. There are many different sides to it. I think for me, I'm someone that if I come across something that's fascinating for me, I like to go very, very deeply into it. I like to become as deeply immersed in it as I can. And at the beginning of my musical education, that did involve a lot of formal training. But later on, with the other kinds of music I'd become connected to, there isn't really any formal training side to it. For example, with the medicine songs, you won't find people sitting around practicing their instruments and figuring out what's going on within the music they're playing. They just pick up a guitar and sing a song. And it's very instinctive. So for me, I think both sides of the equation had equal value. There's something about the inspirational flow of music which can arise for anyone, anywhere, any time if they open themselves to it. And at the same time, there's a tremendous depth and layering of information and understanding that can be revealed once you start to explore the more formal side.
I mean, it's very interesting because I think even if you, for lack of better words, are a Western society, which we usually tend to trace back to Greek roots, probably even earlier to Egyptian, who knows, before that. But even this idea that we still practice today, this idea of like a liberal arts education, it's the idea being like to form an individual with knowledge, to be a whole person, a complete person. And I think music was always a part of that, in the same way that astronomy would be, or cosmology, or mathematics, chemistry, ethics, that all of these things we're seeing is very important. And really all over the world. I mean, even like I'm thinking of in India, like the Vedantic culture, like even these very sacred texts that we still have, that like the Gitas, for example. And from my understanding, the Gita it's the song. Oh, so you have like the Bhagavad Gita, the song of the Bhagavad, or the Advahuta Gita, the song of the Advahuta. And there's this idea that the stories, that the wisdom, the healing codes, the messages were encoded in a song, and that's how that knowledge was passed on. Is that something you've thought about or looked into, with kind of this idea of music like being a very foundational part of the human experience in these cultures all over the world?
Yeah, very much so. I think that there are different reasons for this. If you mentioned about the ancient Greek culture, so in the ancient Greek culture, in the Academy of Plato, the subjects were divided into what he called the 7 liberal arts, and those 7 liberal arts were divided into the quadrivium and the trivium. And the trivium was about engaging with the actual real world, through rhetoric and grammar and logic. And the quadrivium was to do with the invisible worlds, the cosmological secret mysteries of truth, which they get revealed through a number. And so the quadrivium, 4 subjects of the quadrivium were mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and music. And music in this context is understood to obey universal laws, to do with the relationship of different numbers, which is if they're reflected in the intervals of notes and the notes of the scale, and how harmony arises from that. So the harmony of music would be seen as an audible representation of the harmony of spheres. So the harmony of the way the cosmos is expressing itself could be heard by human ears through music based upon a numerical foundation. This was first discovered by Pythagoras. I don't know if you know the story of how he discovered this. So when you hear a single note, it contains within it lots of very quiet notes that you can't actually hear, that they make up the composition of the note. A pure note that has these very, very soft tones are called harmonics, or partials. So a note without any harmonics or partials tones is called a sine tone. And that's the tone that you get like, it's just a very bland sound, like you might get ready. For example, if you're not wearing your seatbelt in the car, and you hear this, that's the sine tone. It's just a pure tone. But musical instruments, violins, guitars, pianos, flutes, all other kinds of instruments, they don't play pure tones like that. They play a tone which is made of a fundamental tone, and then all the other higher partials, which give texture and color to the sound. So the same note played on a flute and a saxophone and a guitar sound very different to our ears because of these partials that can color to the sound.
Second from the vibration of the instrument?
The easiest way to illustrate it is if you have a piano and you play a very low note on the piano and you hit the note hard, or you keep your finger down. As the low note dies away, you'll hear all these other higher notes start to vibrate very, very quietly, and they reveal themselves. It's like subtle aspects of color that might be contained. If you look at a color that you think, oh, that's a deep red, it may have been created by adding this blue or green and other colors to the primary red. So it's a little bit like that. And what Pythagoras discovered was he was actually in a blacksmith's workshop, and he heard the hammer striking the anvil, and he heard all these tones ringing in the air, multiple tones. And he recognized something like that, and he started to experiment, and he realized that when you bow a string, or when you hit something, or when you blow down something, all different ways of producing sound, they produced exactly the same harmonics. So when he discovered that was these immutable mathematical principles underlying the very nature of sound. So that led to this idea that music was included with that quadrigon of the seven liberal arts. And but in a more broader sense, I think that music is, there are two aspects to music that make it unique and universal. One is the way that, well, it's just the very universal nature of music, the universal language, the way that it expresses something beyond words. As long as we're using words, then there's always this sense, like as I was speaking now, there's this sense that I'm trying to get to the point where I can express what I want to express. Whereas with music, when you play a melody under music, there's nothing in the way, it's pure expression. And so I think throughout history, in all different cultures, music has been seen as this very pure form of communication. And the other aspect of music is the way that it expresses feelings. Again, in a very direct and pure way, bypassing the mind or just straight from the heart. So these two aspects of music, the way that it is something that unifies the expression of human consciousness through sound, and the way that it expresses feeling, and naturally led to being such an important part of all the cultures that have evolved.
I'd love to get you to play. We have some construction in the background. I think we'll be able to take that out and post. But maybe we wait a little bit. Is there? I think they're going to go on a lunch break soon, and then we'll have more silence.
There's one other thing, just before we leave this topic, one other thing occurs to me, which is another really important aspect of music, which is not always so important to the listener, depending on the context. But in the context of what we're talking about, music as a vehicle for different kinds of spiritual practices, is the way that music bridges the seen and the unseen worlds, the way that music seems to act as a bridge between what we can feel and see and perceive and understand and experience all around us, and what seems to lie just beyond that. And that may lead people to engage in different kinds of spiritual practices, whether that involves some kind of narrative with deities, or whether it's just a pure practice of the Advaita non-dualistic practice of tuning to universal consciousness. Music has this amazing ability to act as a bridge that can lead us from the very specific place of where we are in this world to something beyond the goals. And then if you can bring that, if we got very seen world centrally to the seen word through what we've heard or expressed through music, then it has very powerful, transportative, expansive quality, which is that is also recognized in the spiritual aspect to the pages.
It's interesting you mentioned Pythagoras, because from what I understand of him, as I was mentioning him, like he actually allegedly spent a lot of time in Egypt, and that's actually where he learned everything that he began to teach. And also interestingly, going back to that idea of silence, like as you were describing the Shakuhachi, the space in between, or the space after the music. It was also very interesting because from what I understood of his school, because he had like an initiation school for students to come in, as a requisite for that, a prerequisite for that was that actually students had to, I think, spend like 1 year in silence before they were even allowed to apply to that school, which is quite interesting. I think that's a really fascinating concept. Like what you're describing as music being a bridge between this world and another world, that's very often loosely put. One of the ways people would describe shamanism as a whole is it's a path to move between different worlds. I think these ideas maybe loosely put of shamanism or shamanic practices or maybe becoming more familiar in a Western world. Um, and yeah, they were a fundamental building block. I think all cultures across the world, including our own. Can you speak a bit more about that? I mean, I think that's something a lot of people, if they sat with, something would resonate as deaths when you say that. I mean, in general, like when people listen to music, they are moved. They're moved to dance. They're moved to go through emotion. People often listen to music to grieve the loss of someone. But I think people feel, and especially music that's maybe stood the test of time, music that's universally seen as powerful. There's something about it that puts people in a state of consciousness that's other than their day-to-day state of consciousness of doing, of all the things we have to do in this reality. And yet often, I think in our cosmovision, we don't speak in terms of moving between worlds. I mean, usually we just accept that there's this world, that there's this reality. And so I think that's maybe difficult for a lot of people to understand. And yet at that same time, like I was saying, I think people, if they sat with that, they also realize that there is something, listening to some very powerful piece of music, that they are transported. I mean, people will even use that word in their vernacular. Like, I listened to a song and I felt transported to another world. I felt like I was in a different place, a place of stillness, a place of peace, a place of greed, and a place of joy. Do you have any sense of what's happening when music is being played or people are listening to music? I mean, you mentioned this one aspect of the heart, which I think is very fascinating. Do you have any like thoughts on the mechanics, the heart space, the emotional space, and like on a deeper level, what that means to you to allow music to move people between worlds?
Hmm. I think when we talk about unseen worlds or other worlds, worlds beyond, parallel worlds, it, these ideas can be, they can become immediately inaccessible. If somebody hasn't had the experience of another world, they may have this kind of vague idea of what that means, some other world beyond. I think it might be easier to understand in terms of hidden aspects of the self which you agree with. So moving between seen and unseen worlds doesn't necessarily need to mean moving from life on planet Earth to some astral dimension. It could mean opening to some chamber of the heart, which is an intimate aspect of ourselves that we've got to have the opportunity to experience because of layers of conditioning which are built up on that aspect of ourselves. So music can have this function of revealing aspects of ourselves which otherwise would have remained veiled. And so in that way it's easier to understand it. And if you think about in the Hindu traditions or the Buddhist traditions, there are a lot of deities that represent different qualities, such as the bodhisattvas that represent compassion, or Manjushri, who represents this as supreme wisdom, and Kali, who represents this kind of fierce, transformative power, and Ganesha, who represents the removal of obstacles. These different deities that represent different qualities, they also represent aspects of ourselves. And so chanting mantras to these deities is not necessarily chanting to some being that lives in some celestial dimension. It's more awakening, deepening, or strengthening our awareness of these aspects of ourselves. And so music in that sense can be a very powerful form of liberation and expansion. And one thing that comes to me in memory is that when I was young, I grew up in a very chaotic household. There was a lot of drama. There was a lot of dysfunctional behavior between parents and children and between siblings. And school was also extremely chaotic. And I was a very sensitive child, and I found it very difficult to hold myself amongst all this chaos. And I wouldn't have been able to say at that time, oh, I'm a sensitive child. I was just confused, basically, and stressed and anxious. Music became a sanctuary for me. Classical music. I was turned on to classical music at a very young age. And what I realized looking back is that I was always drawn to the slow movements of symphonies or concertos or sonatas. A symphony traditionally has 4 movements. And one of them will be the slow movement called the adagio or the lento or the largo. And a concerto will be the same, or a sonata will be the same. And if you listen to an opera, there can be a lot of dramatic music, and then at some point there'll be a very slow song. And I was always drawn to these very slow, soft, gentle pieces of music. And I realized what it was doing, it was regulating and calming my heart. And it was offering me a sanctuary where everything was peaceful. And one aspect of this that I couldn't understand at the time, but I understand now, is that music is a very complete world within itself. It's very self-referential. You can be in a very chaotic environment with all kinds of things going on, but when you put a piece of music on by Bach, everything is contained within that music. It doesn't refer to anything outside of itself in order to give validity to what it wishes to express. And I think I was drawn to classical music as it seemed to represent this parallel world in which every note had its place, every expression of sound, every musical phrase just seemed complete in itself. And so I could retreat into that world to escape the chaos of my environment and find this beautiful landscape of sound in which nothing was out of place. And so that gave me access to some parts of myself that I otherwise might not have had access to. And amongst all the anxiety, there were threads of peace and calm and understanding and reassurance. And when we look at music as it's used in a spiritual context, whether it's plant spirit medicine ceremonies, or it's music for pure meditation in the Buddhist context, it has a similar function. It's not necessarily in the pure shamanic sense leading us into other parallel universes. It's leading us to a deeper understanding of the different layers of our own self. It's peeling back the layers of the conditioned self and allowing us to access. And it functions as a channel to lead us to a more authentic understanding of who we are. And the further you go down these kinds of spiritual practices, whether it's working with plant spirit medicines or a pure meditation, the more you find that at the core of the self is this unifying field of consciousness. And as we are differentiated at birth by our physical experience, by our physical appearance, and by whatever karmic or astrological implications may be involved in our incarnation. And then we have all the layers of conditioning of our culture and society and family and upbringing and different experiences which formulate us. We can start to lose touch with what really lies at the core of all of that, the true essential nature of our being. And hence people become extremely confused, and in that state of confusion, all kinds of badness happens. So music, along with other spiritual tools, can help us to guide us back to that place of purity, of knowing our true self, where the awareness is radiating in a particular kind of frequency without any kind of corruption, which is arising from the conditioned mode. And you mentioned at the beginning of your question about silence. Silence has a big part to play in all of this, because usually when we listen to music, it's the music itself we're interested in. If you go to a concert, somebody's singing songs, or you go to a rave or a festival and we're dancing to the music, you don't want to just be left doing nothing in a pool of silence. But in another context, the music has a function of clearing the way so that the silence is revealed. And within that silence, there's a certain kind of knowing that is revealed. The silence is ordinarily understood to mean the absence of sound, but actually, the true silence contains all sounds. Because when you eradicate or when you quieten intrusive, disturbing thoughts in the mind, and you are able to drop into a place of stillness within the heart, and the mind is calm, then the place that you find there is very broad and expansive. It's not a pinpointed place. And one way of understanding this is there's a famous saying, I'm sure most of your listeners have heard of it, from Buddhism: form is emptiness and emptiness is form. It comes from the Heart Sutra, a teaching of Avalokiteshvara, the supreme bodhisattva of compassion, who is having a dialogue with a disciple. And he's explaining about the ultimate nature of reality, and he's saying how every thing that exists in the physical world, everything you can see and touch, is essentially empty in its true nature. It's like the table over there, as you probably know from the teachers of new physics, quantum physics. If you look at the molecular, atomic and subatomic structure of a table, ultimately you get down to nothingness. And this phrase, emptiness is form, form is emptiness, implies that whatever forms or perceptions or experiences or thoughts we have, if we trace them to their roots, they're all arising and falling from this oceanic pool of emptiness. And so each form is essentially empty in nature, and emptiness in itself contains all of the potential for all of the forms. And so it's a long journey to go from listening to a pop song that you like because it's got a great melody or because the words resonate with some experience you're having in your life, to approaching music as a portal to emptiness and nothingness. But this is an idea this is not such a radical, outlandish idea. It's actually embedded into some of the highest understandings about music and sound and silence in some of the most ancient cultures.
Yeah. I was reminded when you were saying that often in asana yoga, which I think many people are familiar with, I think very often there's this idea of the doing of this asana and that asana, and also the transitions, but I think classically it's why the final asana, the savasana was seen as it's often called the king of the asanas, because it was like all of the work, all of the effort, the cleaning, the movement was building up to this place of not doing. But it wasn't a not doing with the same quality of simply not doing. There was all sort of work and movement and effort, and it was building to this place of then this song, this rest.
Yeah, it's a beautiful parallel. I've heard before that Shavasana is the most difficult of all the postures, because to be truly still and to be truly empty is a very elusive quality of being.
So going back to the Shakuhachi, so you spend a long time studying, learning from it. It's interesting because we've mentioned shamanism a few times, and I think, like I was mentioning earlier, like it's very natural. The human mind likes to compartmentalize, to put things in boxes. And I think even today, although less so, something like shamanism or Buddhism or Zen, like we tend to put these in different boxes. But at the time, and maybe also in retrospect, did you, because I think as we'll get into this work that you started doing with ayahuasca and loosely plant spirit medicine, did you see traces of that in the Zen Buddhism you were experiencing? Because often I think when we're so immersed in something, we don't necessarily look at it from other perspectives. And yet, like, also the Japanese culture is very rich, and there's certainly shamanic aspects to it. There's certainly shamanic aspects to Buddhism. And it's very interesting that you were saying, like, in this tradition, like the Shakuhachi was seen as an integral part to that experience. Do you have any sense of like where that came from? Because usually in Buddhism, certainly the Shakuhachi, or maybe music in general, I think from a very broad perspective is not necessarily seen as something that's fundamental to Buddhism. It's usually seen as more of a practice of meditation, a practice of thought, a practice of how one lives their life. But I think that instrument being merged into Buddhism, into Zen, is something very interesting. And I would imagine something that's drawing on something even much older than the Buddha himself. Well, the school of Zen Buddhism that utilized the Shakuhachi as part of their practice is very unique, is very special. And I had a vague interest in spiritual teachings since I was my student days. But if I hadn't discovered the Shakuhachi, I don't know how deeply I would have gone into that, because I was so immersed in music. I was very fortunate, I think, that I met the Shakuhachi, and that acted as a funnel to everything else that followed in the worlds of spirituality and healing. But it is a very unique take on the Buddhist teachings. The monks who played the Shakuhachi were called Komuso, which is 3 Japanese characters, Ko, Muso. And what that means is the monks of emptiness and nothingness. And so it's a very unique and richly resonant aspect of the Buddhist universe. And I find myself in quite a unique place as a bloke from Northern England who spent years in Japan immersed in Zen Buddhism, and then years in Brazil immersed in plant spirit medicine ceremonies. And on the surface, the two seem like diametrically opposed. One is about stillness and refinement and austere practices. And when you go to Brazil, the energy of the forest and the energy of the ceremonies and the energy of the people and the music, everything is vibrant and dynamic and animated and noisy. So you, on the surface, you might think they're very, very different, but slowly I began to see the similarities between the two. And it wasn't apparent to me immediately. For a while, I felt as if I had these two worlds in parallel, and I'd moved from one to the other. And then gradually I began to understand the aspects that they have in common with each other. And some of it is connected to this idea of music expressing the inexpressible, and the idea of music acting as a bridge between seen and unseen worlds. But there are other aspects to it too. With regard to the Shakuhachi, let's go back to the Shakuhachi. It's become quiet outside. It might be easy if I illustrate something. I think it's a great time. Okay. This episode is sponsored by La Huayra Ayahuasca Retreat. La Huayra is the highest rated ayahuasca retreat in South America, with over 600 5-star reviews on Google. La Huayra combines authenticity, accessibility, and affordability. You'll experience powerful, authentic ceremonies led by indigenous shamans in a stunning venue located just 1 hour from Medellin in Colombia. Surrounded by nature, yet with comforts like hot water and Wi-Fi, it's the perfect place to connect, heal, and grow. La Huayra's team has guided more than 2,000 people people through life-changing transformations, and they keep it affordable with retreats starting at just $645 US. Whether you're coming for healing, clarity, or a deeper connection to yourself, Lowaida is the best choice. If it is your first time drinking ayahuasca, you will love Lowaida's 3.5-hour preparation course and integration support, all included in the price. And if you mention the Universe Within podcast, they will offer you a free bodywork session during your stay. Sam Believ is the founder. I interviewed him on episode 166 of the podcast, and he's a really good guy with a good heart. So if you'd like more information, visit lowaida.com to book your retreat or to learn more, and there'll be a link to that in the show notes.
I think hopefully we have a lunch break, so maybe a good hour of silence.
So I've been involved in the Shakuhachi world for almost 40 years. And in that time, I've developed my understanding of what it means to play the Shakuhachi in terms of 3 simple words: sound, breath, awareness. So it starts with the sound that the physical ear perceives frequencies. And the source of that sound is the breath interacting with the bamboo. And already when you move from sound to breath, it's already quite an expansion, because the breath is this kind of an aspect of spirit which animates our lives. And it also indicates something about it also invites us to consider the difference between the inner world and the outer world, because the in-breath is very personal to each person, whereas the out-breath leads to a world in which we're all basically breathing the same air. And so already there's an opening where we shift our focus from the sound to the breath. And then the intention behind the person who's breathing and playing, the awareness that goes into that, is the 3rd stage of expansion. So when you reverse that, and you start with awareness, and then you channel awareness into breathing, and then the breathing manifests as sound, that gives an indication of the broad sort of canvas within which Shakuhachi music has its foundation. So I'm going to illustrate for you.
It's interesting on a note with that. I recently, I think 2 episodes ago, I interviewed a guy who wrote a book called The Power of Awe, and essentially how this aspect of awe, trying to find ways to cultivate it, and that he really found there's a true healing in awe, and it's something in a lot of our cultures we've been disconnected from. But then developing a method that he also calls awe, AWE, as something that can be practiced. And it's very interesting because it's almost the exact thing you're speaking about, in that A stands for awareness, the W is waiting, kind of that space, and then the E is exhale, the breath. And so, I think very often when we're speaking about things, like there's universal truths to things, and they resonate, and traditions, and as you said, similarities between all of these things all over the world, and what people are getting at.
The Shakuhachi is also an instrument that comes from a very esoterical, hidden tradition, in the sense that the music that was played by the komuso, apart from a few pieces that were intended to be played in public, because the monks, one aspect of their life was a very kind of mendicant aspect where they would roam around the countryside and moving through different villages, and they would have a function in society as shakuhachi players, because certain pieces had a social function. There's one piece that would be played for safe passage of souls at funerals. Another piece would be played for the safe birth when a woman was giving birth. And Japanese people in those days lived in houses with very thin walls, with paper on the walls of the windows, often sliding doors, shoji. And so the shakuhachi player would stand just outside the house in the street and play this particular piece called sanan, while a woman inside was in delivery. So there was this social aspect to the shakuhachi, people aware of the shakuhachi, but most of the practice went on within the temples and the monasteries. It was a very, very intimate, introspective, private practice. And so because of that, the music was never really heard until quite recently. My teacher, Yokoyama Katsuya, was actually the person that was largely instrumental in introducing the shakuhachi to the outside world. In the late 60s and 70s, he toured the world playing shakuhachi to Western classical audiences, New York, Paris, and Sydney, all over the world. And people heard the shakuhachi for the first time. And this music from the Komuso tradition, which collectively is called Honkyoku, which means original music, had never been heard before. Now it's widely available. You can go to Spotify and listen. The recordings that my teacher made and other people from his generation were the first recordings ever of this music. And they gave public performances in concert halls for the first time ever. And what I've noticed myself as a performer of the shakuhachi, I've played in many different kinds of situations, is that although the practice of the shakuhachi was developed as a very individual practice, and so the breath and awareness aspect of the equation are very much to do with the practitioner themselves. When you perform, this is very readily perceivable and able to be experienced and felt by the people you're playing to. One example of this is I was in Sao Paulo, and I was invited to give a concert in some kind of wellness center where there were different kinds of workshops and healing concerts and events happening. And so I sat there, I was playing my shakuhachi, and in the middle of the performance, I started to question, what am I doing here? An English guy in the heart of this metropolis and 20 million people playing this Japanese flute. What could possibly be the significance of this? And yet, surrounded by all this chaos of city life, and I'm just sitting here playing long notes on this flute. And after the concert, a woman came up to talk to me. She had tears in her eyes. She was so moved. She took my hands in her hands and she looked at me and she said, she was a social worker, and her life was full of violence and abuse and misery, her working life. And listening to my music had made her realize that she still had the capacity to feel subtle, delicate feelings that she thought she'd lost. She thought her heart had become so kind of blunted and brutalized, that she'd lost the capacity to feel these very subtle, delicate feelings that my music evoked in her. And the realization that her heart was still functioning in that delicate, soft, subtle way gave her the courage to go back out and continue with her work. It was very moving. So the music does translate, even though it's based on this very refined personal practice. So when I'm playing the shakuhachi acts as a kind of mirror in a way. The sound that comes out of the instrument reflects whatever's going on inside of me. And it's a very difficult instrument to play. It's one of the reasons there are very few players. You make sound by blowing over this very fine edge. And in the beginning, it's very difficult to make sound at all. You can huff and puff for weeks without getting any sound. And you need to be very dedicated to refine the embouchure, or find the place where the sound is, and then work with that. And what I've noticed is, if my mind is agitated, if I'm distracted, it's much more difficult to find the sound. And when my mind is more calm, then the sound comes more easily. And so some of the pieces that were developed by the practitioners of the shakuhachi, they involve a lot of very dynamic energy, which has the intention of kind of clearing the mental space, like blowing all the cobwebs. And then there are other pieces that involve extremely long, gentle sounds, which fade into silence. So there's these two poles to the sound. Ultimately, in the way that I've come to understand the shakuhachi, it may not be the same for all shakuhachi players. The true essence is the very subtle point where the sound fades into silence. And learning to play a long note that fades away imperceptibly into silence until you reach a place where you're not even sure if you can hear the sound anymore. And as the ears strain to listen to as the sound disappears, the ears are left in this open state, and then suddenly everything's wide open. So it's very functional. Even though, as I said at the beginning of our chat, even though the music is enchanting and lyrical and expressive, the significance of it goes beyond that in the way that it opens up. So I'll give you a couple of examples. You need to just sit a little bit more comfortably. There's also a ritual aspect to playing the shakuhachi. So rather than just picking up and starting to play, I would get myself really settled first. I might light an incense stick or light a candle and just check my posture. Everything's... Would you like to do that? We have both. Got a candle right here. Yeah, why not? Let's do it.
It's a copal.
So I play you first of all a part of the piece that expresses a very dynamic state. To go back to what I was saying, so when I'm preparing to play, I would sort of check my posture that I'm sort of relaxed and aligned, balanced. And then I'm just checking with the breath and just feel the natural rhythm of the breath, which has its own intelligence. So just dropping into that space and just feeling that natural flow of the breath. And then pick up the instrument and place it on my lips and maybe take one more breath. Then we move into the next part of the piece, which is suddenly the energy becomes much calmer. So you can hear how just with the simple sound of the flute, you can, within a short space of time, express a lot of different qualities. So it does have this very expressive range, but ultimately what the Shakuhachi leads us to is this way of opening into silence, which I'll illustrate here in a different kind of music, where the tones are much longer, and ultimately it's about the tailing off of the sound and what happens at that moment.
It's a very powerful instrument. I'm not sure if I mentioned, but I think I came across the Shakuhachi maybe 25 years ago, and just by sound, not an actual instrument, but it was very deeply moving. And I've also been very interested in Japanese culture. Very interested in martial arts. I practice a lot of martial arts, jiu-jitsu, and just was very fascinated by Japanese culture as a whole, the quality of things, the appreciation of things, and but I always found something about the Shakuhachi deeply moving and deeply meditative. And so thank you for sharing that.
Have you come across the Japanese concept of ma?
I'm not sure.
Ma means the space between things. So Shakuhachi music is the space between the notes, which is pregnant with meaning and possibilities of within the transformational nature of the interaction between sound and the silence. But it's infused in all of the Japanese arts and crafts, and presumably in martial arts as well. the stillness between movements in kendo or aikido. I'm just guessing because I haven't studied these things. But in flower arranging, which is called kado, or ikebana as it's more commonly known, when a Japanese master working with kado, when they arrange the flowers in the vase, they're not only thinking about the beautiful colors and forms and shapes that the plants, that the flowers and the leaves make, they're thinking about the shapes between, the space in between. For example, if you look at a tree and you look at the branches of a tree, ordinarily you would just focus on the branches, and the space between the branches where you can see the sky, that's the ma. It's also the pause between thoughts. And in the Japanese tea ceremony, on the surface it looks like a very, very simple thing, making a pot of tea and sharing a cup of tea. The tea ceremony is all about the way that the utensils are held, the movements, the rhythm, the timing, the shape of the space, and the space between movements, the pauses, where something is activated through stillness. This is called ma. And it's a very unique quality. And the Shakuhachi, in a way, is kind of the perfect expression of that, because it's all about activating silence. And I did find, through the chaos of, well, chaos is not the right word, but through the very dynamic energy of the medicine ceremonies that I became involved with, there's a similar thing going on. Some of the deepest experiences that people have in medicine ceremonies are the silences, where everything just goes very, very quiet for a while. And then you're able to access almost kind of mystical states through that silence. And I found that the music, although the music contains lots of teachings and messages, when there's words involved, and when it doesn't involve words like the ikaros or other kinds of music, it's still functioning as a kind of a guide through that space. I noticed a similar thing, the way that quite often the silences between the songs would be the most significant and important moments in the ceremony. And the music seems to have a similar function of engaging the mind or the heart or the spirit in a certain way so that it can later become quiet and receptive to what lies within the deeper level.
I spent a long time in the Amazon of working quite extensively in ceremonies as a facilitator. I think we did something like 7 ceremonies in 9 days, 2 days off, and then another group would come in. So that was for many years, so a lot of ceremonies. And I think there is something to that. I mean, obviously the ceremony itself is very powerful. All sorts of things are being moved and cleansed and ordered and opened. But we would also always tell people to, if they had any doubt, to always stay in the ceremony space at the end, because often things would still move. And I think it's a very common experience that when the ceremony is closed, I mean, when the songs have stopped, or when there's no more movement, when it's by word, when it's said it's closed, that there's a certain energy that begins to settle in. It's also very interesting because you're in the jungle, so it's certainly not silent in terms of no noise, but there's an awareness that you begin to tap into the jungle, the aliveness of it, but there's a stillness. And I think, as you said, because there has been all of this movement, all of this work, and very often for people, that's also when something begins to drop in, something begins to open up in a much deeper level. I think much like in that way I was saying with yasana yoga, it's because I think sometimes we can there's a vital importance to the doing, to the action, to that more archetypal yin, yang aspect. But then when that all fades away and we're left in that more open, receptive space and kind of the barriers are broken down, and there's often something very profound that can happen. I know even from my own experience, like actually that was probably the biggest experience I ever had was once the ceremony was over.
And quite often the nature of that profound experience is an encounter with the self. And as I was explaining about the Shakuhachi practice, how I would prepare myself in a certain way, light a candle or some incense and sit on a cushion and check my posture and breathing. This kind of way of framing the experience is one of the parallels with the medicine ceremonies. People change into special clothes, move into a special ceremonial space, cleanse the space with incense, light candles, and have make prayers. All this is a way of putting a frame around the experience so as to highlight the fact that everything happening in that space is consecrated and has a kind of heightened significance. And quite often when people enter into a spiritual practice, whether it's with plant spirit medicines or some other tradition, a lot of the focus is on external sources of teachings, whether it's a guru or a shaman or a spirit plant or a mantra or a visual representation of a deity. All of these things ultimately are leading us to our own source of inner wisdom, helping us to gain access to the highest wisdom that is contained within our own self as an expression of the whole. And activating our own inner healer or our own inner shaman, inner guru, so that the movement outside to an external source becomes redirected inwards, not to the ego or to the constructed self, but more to a kind of more profound sense of self from which the universal wisdom, which is contained in all aspect of creation, can be revealed. And so in a way we could see all of the elements of the ceremony or of the practice as leading to those moments when we have a authentic encounter with our own self. And then the purpose of this would not be simply to remain in some elevated state where we're having this a beautiful mystical encounter with our true nature. It would be to absorb, digest, and integrate the teachings from that so we can then take them back out into the world, into our understanding and interpretation of the events that threaten to overwhelm us, or into our relationships or our creative, professional lives, so that the way that we act, think, and feel becomes informed with wisdom from a deeper source. And in that way, you can see all of the aspects of the ceremony, from lighting the first candle, putting on our ceremonial clothes, to closing prayers, as a way of clearing those pathways to be able to understand a little bit more and the source within from which we can act authentically. It's a long journey. It's a practice. Hence, as you say, we don't just make one ceremony, we make dozens or hundreds or thousands. Same with yoga. We don't just get away with one yoga practice. It's kind of, the ripples are infinite. And the work that we do on ourselves doesn't necessarily come to an end when we finish this life journey. It's all part of a bigger unfolding. And we learn how to offer up the merits of our work for the liberation of all beings, rather than purely for our own healing. So everything becomes part of a broader wave of transformational, energetic healing. And this seems to be reflected also in the way that different cultures which have cultivated their own traditions over centuries or millennia are now becoming available. So you can move from a yoga practice in Rishikesh to a Buddhist meditation practice, maybe in San Francisco, and then to a medicine ceremony in Brazil, or to a Sufi practice in Konya. And the same essential universal truths will be at the heart of all of those practices. And as the sort of external circumstances of the world we live in seem to become more intense, so these teachings which have been incubated for so long in private, in secret, in intimate, esoteric environments become more and more widely available. It's almost as if the sort of supreme intelligence from which these teachings and understandings arise is responding to the urgency with which they seem to be. On the one hand, there's a yearning, a kind of collective yearning for understanding and healing. And on the other hand, there seems to be an offering through Source of more and more teachings, more and more possibilities of connection and interaction and immersion within those teachings. It's a very special time to be alive.
So what was that journey like for you? I always, I think from a young age, that phrase that we have in English, a jack of all trades and a master of nothing, I always felt somehow very resonant to that, because I was very curious. I very much like to try different things. And as you said, often when I went into something, I really went into it until I really felt I had some grasp over it, not necessarily a mastery, but some deeper understanding. And then I felt this need to discover something else, because I think very much what I was looking for was some universal truth, and finding different ways to be able to understand that, a different shape, a different color of that. So I think there's something very powerful and very beautiful about trying different things, and there's something very powerful and beautiful about really dedicating yourself to one thing. That's often, I think, where true mastery comes from. Like you said, the Shakuhachi, I would imagine it's a lifetime practice, lifetimes, depending on our worldview. And even martial arts, like you were saying, these ideas of the space in between. I think that very much does exist in martial arts, and that's a very high level to be able to practice at. Usually you just, how do I not get punched in the face? How do I get this guy off me? And yet, through years, through decades, through a lifetime, I think those things begin to descend from the realm of theory into an actual practice of being able to move from that space of stillness to understand and to flow with those energies. So from that space of really dedicating yourself to a practice, from music, and then to the practice of Shakuhachi, and also, I think, like you said, we do live in a time where we do have access to a lot more things, and I think there's also an openness to people being able to practice different things. I think from a long time, a lot of these traditions were very guarded, and there wasn't that possibility to go outside that tradition, because it was seen that you were going against.
Absolutely, yeah. You look at the writings of Gurdjieff and the crazy journeys those guys went on to seek out the spiritual masters in the mountains and the deserts. Now you just go to the bookstore and every teaching is there. Not necessarily the same as immersing yourself in a tradition, but there's definitely been a big shift in availability now.
What was that like? Because less so nowadays, but I think for a time in some of these spiritual practices like Buddhism or Christianity or any religion, any practice, martial arts like I practiced, it was often seen as something other than good to go outside that tradition, and especially something that, as you said, seemingly on the surface was very different. this meditative practice of contemplation, a practice of austerity, a practice of really being in this tradition, to going to something, as you said, which is ingesting a sacrament, like taking what a lot of people would see as a drug, something from the outside, something that I don't necessarily have inside of me. Like, there is a duality in this, that I'm taking something from the outside, moving to these traditions, which are very group oriented. They are rooted in a very different culture, the jungles of Brazil, and even rooted in very dynamic, synergistic practices of Christian traditions from the Portuguese, of African spiritism, and all of these deities that are often invoked, and this very indigenous Brazilian, even pre-Brazil, but indigenous practice of those lands, of working with something like the Daime of ayahuasca, or Yahe, many different names for it. What was that journey like for you? Was there conflict in that? Was it, as you said, I think a lot of times these things happen where, when there is a need, whether it's through our own suffering or whatever that may be, these things appear in our lives. And so sometimes we can resist that, but in the end, at some point, you obviously didn't, because you went very deep into it. What was that journey like for you, from being rooted in this tradition to moving into a tradition that, at least as you said on the surface, is quite different? It's a different path. I think still at the roots, moving towards truth, but in form very different. Ingesting a sacrament, being with people, ideas of Christianity, ideas of spirits, of also moving to different worlds, which was a very common idea in these shamanic practices, of receiving information, of communicating the spirit or spirits. It's quite a shift, and yet something about that practice obviously very much spoke to you. But I know that's a big question, but if you can maybe just speak about like what that journey was like for you.
Mm-hmm. I think there are a lot of correlations or similarities in terms of the general intentions of both those different kinds of worlds of practice. As we know, working with plant spirit medicines is a world in which we come to understand suffering as a teacher rather than an enemy. So there's a lot of purging, there's a lot of confrontation with difficult parts of ourselves. You may go to a work, into a ceremony, with the intention to cultivate forgiveness for somebody in your life that you found it difficult to forgive. And in the process of that ceremony, you might find that rather than forgiveness manifesting, what manifests is a lot of anger. The thing that's standing in the way of your forgiveness for yourself or for another person, or receiving forgiveness, whatever aspect to it, of forgiveness you're working with, you may very likely find that rather than the quality of forgiveness itself arising in a very gentle and beautiful way, all the things that stand in the way of forgiveness within your own self are the things that come into focus, and that can be very, very uncomfortable. So we become acclimatized to working in an environment that involves a certain amount of confrontation, struggle, and hardship. And there are words for this in the culture, like teia and passage. And so there's a direct correlation there with the teachings of the Buddha, as I mentioned at the outset, whose whole teaching is based on this idea that most of the suffering in the world happens because people are not willing to accept the essential true nature that suffering exists, and try to run away from it and avoid it, thereby creating more and more layers of suffering. And so there's a direct correlation there. When we come into a ceremony, the suffering becomes a teacher. And another aspect is the aspect of reverence, of sacredness for nature, which is linked to the idea of reconnected to the highest source of teachings, whether it's Mother Nature herself or our own inner wisdoms we were talking about earlier. And the collective nature of the experience also has similarities, because in Buddhism they talk about the three jewels: the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The Sangha is the community of spiritual seekers who are following the teachings of the Dharma. And there's a direct parallel there to medicine communities, where the collective power of the healing currents is so much stronger than only one person or any one individual's experience. It's very unusual to find people working with these medicines in a one-on-one setting, unless it's a kind of dieta context, which is a specific aspect of the work. Generally, these are group settings where the collective energy creates the current, or the corrente, through which the healing power manifests. And so the acknowledgement of that healing is a collective effort, which is made up of individuals going through their own healing process, but not starting and ending with an individual. That's very much built into the both of those worlds. That's why the Buddhist communities are built around temples and monasteries, where the collective energy. And yeah, the similar thing in many different traditions, like the Bhakti yoga traditions, where you get hundreds of people chanting or singing the name of Krishna in the bhajan. So I could recognize certain similarities, even though externally there were differences. But I think above and beyond that, there was just such a clear thread running through my own personal journey of healing that just very naturally flowed from one tradition into the other, because ultimately these traditions are not about focusing on the external specifics. They're about where it's leading you. The areas where you might expect some kind of sort of dissonance, because as an English person immersing myself in the culture of another entirely different country and history, I'd already kind of dealt with that with the Shakuhachi, because it was very natural for me as an English person to be playing the Shakuhachi. And when I was in Japan for many years, I did come to notice that within the Shakuhachi community, there were a few isolated individuals who would think, what's an English guy doing playing this history? I can't possibly understand it because it's not Japanese. And they wouldn't be able to understand the potential for a non-Japanese person to authentically connect in that way. But more than that, I met with very appreciative and engaging and welcoming teachers and players who recognized the value of this music in me, exposed to people from other countries who were then sharing it. And so when I came into the medicine world, I encountered a similar kind of attitude. I didn't really, very rarely came against individuals who'd be like, what are you doing in English guy here at this Amazonian medicine? It was much more welcoming and embracing, and an acknowledgement that the fact that people from other cultures are turning up and allowing themselves to be touched and immersed in these practices has a tremendous value. And so there was always a natural flow for me. There is this thing of cultural appropriation, which has become one of the sort of themes of the world in which we live in. And that's a very particular aspect of the topics that we're talking about, because I could be accused of cultural appropriation by being an English person playing a shakuhachi, or being an English person working with Amazonian plant medicines. But what I found is that through deep immersion in these traditions, rather than just a superficial dabbling, the universal aspect of the teachings and the practices actually finds a very welcome home within the heart of people like myself, who are recognizing the value, not just for themselves, but for the people around them, who are being engaged in that way. And I think it's got a lot to do with the degree of respect with which you approach something. And when you're working with ayahuasca, the respect is inbuilt because you can't mess around with her. You can't, take her for your own purposes, because she will always express her own awe about whatever power you yourself may think that you have. And I have witnessed and experienced firsthand, over and over again, through the work I've been doing with this medicine for the last 30 years, the genuine, lasting, transformational power of the healing processes that people go through. And not everybody can travel to the Amazon rainforest. Not everybody can have that experience firsthand. And it seems that she herself, the queen of the forest, the mother ayahuasca, is very enthusiastic about sharing her knowledge and her healing powers with whoever wishes to come and drink. Because the sort of desecration, pollution, destruction of the world we see all around us is something that probably will only really start to change when enough individual people take that step to engage with genuine self-transformation, so as to be able to manifest a different kind of truth within themselves, rather than expecting change to come from the outside. So if these practices can spread around the globe in a way that more and more individuals have the chance to undertake, that they engage with their own deep practice in transformational healing, then, as Gandhi said, be the change that you used to see in the world. So the more and more people that engage with change within themselves, the self-healing at the deepest level, the more there is a chance for Mother Nature herself to be understood, reconnected with in genuinely helpful ways. So everything kind of makes sense to me in the bigger picture. I don't see any sort of real clashes, culture clashes, or clashes of understanding, or different kind of paradigms that don't fit together. On the surface, there will always be different external manifestations, but underneath the surface, the deeper you go, before you arrive at a place of unity. That seems to be a core teaching of all of the spiritual teachers, whichever corner of the globe they come from. So some kind of point of unified consciousness is a kind of common intention that seems to lie behind all of those traditions.
I think Santo Daime is very interesting in that way, that it, as I was saying, it is a very synergistic tradition, and it is drawing upon different cultures, different people to create something new in a way, which there's a guy who I studied with. He comes from a group of people called the Tubu in the Colombian Amazon. His title is Amika. And the Tubu prophesies that this is a time of what they call as the Diro Amasa, the children as the dawn. And they say it's the people who can bridge the medicine of the four directions to create a new Moloka, to create a new earth, a new paradigm of time and space. And I think it's very strong because it's acknowledging that there is medicine and orthodoxism. We're also in a time of also creating something new, of moving beyond perhaps isolation and rigid forms, but to take what is medicine. I think that's ultimately what any good doctor is something words you use it.
The Santo Daime is a very good example, actually, of a cultural tradition and a spiritual practice where, as in so many others, you do have this very kind of orthodox, conventional form of the practice. And then you have other branches of that which are more open to evolution. And so the founder of the Santo Daime, Mestre Panombe Hirele Serra, he passed away in 1971. And he was born in or sure it was 1892 or 1890. And in the course of his lifetime, he evolved this amazing way of working with ayahuasca that allowed, he created basically a template for a word which could be transported from Brazil to any place they people could come together in a particular format, assuming you've got responsible and experienced facilitators. And in the course of his lifetime, he refined this to include the songs that were sung, the prayers that were said, the way that the room was set up, the clothes people wore, the way that different ceremonies were done on different days of the year. There's a very precise, calibrated spiritual practice. And there are some people within the Santo Daime, particularly in the town where he lived and worked and out, and he broke his original church, which is still there. There are some people who feel that the Santo Daime is only really authentic if it's practiced in the form that he left it when he passed away. And there are other groups, like ours, our group as well, which are based on the foundation of Santo Daime practice, the core principles, and the core understandings about how to hold space, and yet are open to new expressions of the spiritual teachings pulling in from different directions. And in a way, this is an expression of Mestre Neo's own power, because in his lifetime, he unified elements of Afro-Brazilian spirituality, which were from his ancestral lineage, with Amazonian spirituality, and with the Christian aspects that were imported from the dominant colonial culture. And all of those three elements are interwoven in what became the Santo Daime. And then there's this fourth line called the Niña Oriental, which he never incorporated in his lifetime, although he does in several of his songs talk about the Estrella Oriental, which has come to be seen as the expression of Eastern teachings through either the Hindu Vedic forms of devotional practice to Shiva and Krishna, or whether it's in the Buddhist teachings, or whether it's in the teachings that the Advaita or Sufi teachings. And so the way that I've experienced it is that when I first came in the Santo Daime, I had a shock to find myself in a space with very strong Christian symbolism, images of Jesus and Virgin Mary. And this is not part of my culture at all. I actually grew up in an atheist family background and was never drawn to Christianity. And I actually had a kind of resistance to it because I associated Christianity with very oppressive, bloodthirsty instincts of Christians going back over centuries who had raped and pillaged and genocided their way across the world. And it was that whole world of Christianity was tainted for me on oppressive practices, as it seemed to me and a lot of people from my generation of the contemporary Christian church as well. So some part of me was closed to that. And over the years, I kept going to the Santo Daime ceremonies, not because I was drawn to Christianity, it's simply because the authentic nature and the revelations that came from the plant itself, from the ceremony, or from the beautiful souls that I met, and that community was the inspiration to me. And I knew I wouldn't find that much anywhere else. So I was drawn to it like a hummingbird to a flower. And I just kind of made peace with the fact that there was this strong Christian aspect. And then slowly I started to open to it in a new way and to realize that the wound I was carrying in myself, through the resistance to those teachings, could be softened through reopening to the beautiful teachings that Jesus Christ had to offer. It didn't mean I became a Christian or an evangelist for Christian teachings, but it meant that that part of me that was closed could open up and become softened and be available. And then I started to understand that the teachings of Christ consciousness had this esoteric universal aspect to it. The same was, because of course the teachings of a Buddha can also get channeled into very orthodox and restrictive forms. And you find that in all spiritual traditions, there's always going to be this sort of literal interpretation and the guardians of a tradition. They become a bit of institutionalized to control it. And there'll always be individual people who have a more visionary approach where they can recognize that these teachings have a value from the tradition within which they're implanted that needs to be respected and approached with humility. And at the same time, the personal relationship with those teachings is something that evolves from one's own experience and understanding of what be enforced from the outside. So in that way, the teachings, I never become someone who studies the Bible when I work the anthropology from the Bible, but certainly the core qualities of the teachings that Jesus has that are expressed in the Santo Daime tradition is something I'm not afraid of anymore, and I very readily embrace. And I've seen that aspect of my own journey reflected in many of the people around me. And my own songs that I've received, because I started to receive my own songs quite early on in my engagement with the Santo Daime. And they also reflect something of this universal nature, because a lot of the songs that I received, they have mantras from Buddhist traditions interwoven with Portuguese or English lyrics. And sometimes the different deities from the Afro-Brazilian traditions like Iemanjá might find themselves in the same song sitting next to Tara. And the Buddhist tradition, the Buddhist Bodhisattva Popasha. And so I guess my own journey has led me to this place where I'm open to all the different flavors and textures of music and spiritual teachers that all seem to lead somehow to the same destination, whether it's seen in the most expansive universal way or when immersed into personal deepest changes of our own hearts.
I think one of the really interesting aspects of the archetype of what we're talking about in that idea of plant, spirit, medicine, or record. Like, even if you break down those three words, it's a plant, to which something like ayahuasca is a plant. If it's a sacrament that we ingest, it's referred to as medicine, meaning that it's medicine for the body, for the mind, for the spirit. And that word spirit, which is, I think it could be said as that idea of moving between worlds, the C and the B and C, connecting to, as you said, our own innate wisdom, intelligence, the intelligence of, if we're looking at it from a Christian point of view, Force consciousness or the Buddha nature or God, however we have to look at that. I think one of the interesting things, as we mentioned in the beginning, is this idea of music, of sound, and that often people who go deeply into that work, they often recount to somebody thing, which is that they channeled music, or they channeled songs. Something is given to them, or they receive something. And I don't really know of other traditions that speak of that. Although at the same time, I would imagine many, I think as you mentioned, even like Paul McCartney, and I think there are cases of many even popular musicians who would say they received a song.
Well, you know the story about how the song Yesterday. It's a classic story. I've heard him tell it in different versions many times in interviews. And he woke up with the song fully formed, just the melody, not the words, with his head. And it felt so fully formed and so familiar to him that he assumed it was a tune that he'd already heard from somewhere else. So when he went into the studio the next day, he asked his bandmates and he asked George Martin, the producer, "What's this song?" And nobody recognized it. And he checked everybody that he booked. Nobody recognized it. And so he was forced to realize, actually, this is my song. He didn't have the words. The words came later. In the beginning, he was just singing some nonsense words, and then gradually the words came. And that's a classic example of how a popular musician literally received a song in his dreams, woke up with it fully formed. But this is a fascinating topic, and it's one that I've given a lot of thought to over the years. Because when you think of received souls in medicine communities, the basic understanding is that the person that's receiving the soul is functioning as a channel to receive messages or teachings from the spirit realm. And then these are shared with the community, and the person who's received the souls becomes a kind of a mouthpiece, a representative for the spirit that wants to express itself. And quite often, as was in the case of Mestre Irineo, he had no musical experience. And he said about when he first drank ayahuasca, because when he first drank ayahuasca, it was with indigenous people, because there wasn't anyone else working with ayahuasca in those days, 100 years ago. And when he first drank ayahuasca, a lady appeared in the moon and came down to speak to him. The spirit being. And he just had arrived in this area after a long journey of many years of traveling across the whole of Brazil, because he was born in Maranhão, which is on the far eastern side of Brazil, where the Amazon River opens up into the Atlantic Ocean. And his father and grandfather and great-grandfather were all from the era when there was this slavery in Brazil. The slaves were only finally emancipated in Brazil in 1898, when Mestre Irineo was about 6 years old. So he grew up in the slave culture. And he was of the generation that were able to travel as free men for the first time. It was a unique opportunity. And there are over 3 million people, Black Africans, taken from Africa to Brazil in the hundreds of years that the colonial powers were engaged in this practice of slavery. And so he was born from this culture that was deeply rooted in slavery. And then he found himself as a teenager able to travel. So he started to travel. He made his way up the Amazon River all the way to where 6,000 kilometers to where Brazil meets with the border of Bolivia and Peru. And he didn't have any real intention in this journey he was making. He was just making his way. He stopped in a few places along the way. He worked on the ships. He worked as a gardener. He had different jobs. And then he found himself in this area where he started to work as a rubber tapper. And so he met indigenous people, and he was invited to drink ayahuasca. And it's very unusual. There are not many people were invited to drink ayahuasca with indigenous people at that time. And he was very strikingly different in his physical appearance from the people of that area, because he was 7 foot tall, and he had completely dark black skin. There were never the people in that area that were so tall or of that an African ancestry. So this very striking man appeared in this community, and he was given medicine. Or when he first drank it, this woman, a female deity, appeared to him and said to him, "The reason you're here is because I have guided you the whole of this journey and brought you here so that you could now be here and you could see me and I could talk to you. And I have a mission to offer you if you will accept it." And the mission that she offered him was to take ayahuasca out of the forest and create a new way of working on it that had spread all over the world. And so that's what happened. That's exactly what happened. And she said to him, "I'm going to give you my teachings in the form of songs that you just say." And he said to her, "I don't know how to sing. I don't have any songs and I don't have a voice for singing." And she said, "Well, you don't have to worry about that. You just open your mouth and I will do the rest." So that's what happened. He opened his mouth and there's the most incredible song appeared. The first song of this songbook, which is the most extraordinary melody. I'll just play the melody. It goes like this. And this is for a person with no musical experience at all. the most amazingly sophisticated melody. He just opened his mouth and it came out. So right from the outset in the Santo Daime tradition, and I assume it's the same in other indigenous cultures too, this aspect of receiving a song has this almost magical aspect to it, where the person that's singing the song is not equal to any of their own desire to express something or their own experience or knowledge. They're simply channeling something. So when I first started to receive my own songs, I found myself in a very different position because I'm a fully educated, trained musician. I was studying composition at university. I understand about music, but I've been writing music all my life. But when these songs started to come to me, it was a totally different experience. I knew what it was like. I've written pieces for orchestras and for string quartets and for brass bands and jazz ballads and all kinds of different musical settings. I'd never written songs before. I worked with with instrumental ensembles, whether it's folk music or jazz or classical or avant-garde music. I never wrote songs or anything involving voices. And also, the music that I was engaged with was, for want of a better word, sophisticated. Baroque music, contemporary classical music, jazz music, not simple music, strumming chords on a guitar, one-note melodies. But when the first songs started to come to me, they came to me from a place that I didn't know what this place was. It wasn't the place inside me where I was used to music coming from. And there was not any possibility of me engaging in this in a way of refining and editing and manipulating. And, as I'm used to when you write a piece of music, you kind of write it as you go along. And it can be a very simple piece of music or what a complex piece of music, but it's a process. The music develops itself as you're going along. This was an entirely different experience. I heard the song fully formed with the words in this very simple song-like form that I was not at all familiar with it, singing or expressing it. And I was very aware that something in me was opening to connect to some message that wanted to be heard. And before that, I had always assumed that the messages of the songs were at the point of delivery intended for the community at large. But through my experience, I came to understand that these teachings are primarily for me. And then as I sing them, they become available to people around me. And then at some point they get written down, then they get put into songbooks, and then there's recordings, and then everybody knows the songs. It all starts with this personal encounter with some kind of source that wishes to be expressed through you, wishes to share its knowledge. And the jury is out on whether this is coming from some parallel sphere, as people in Arizona would understand through their experience and their culture, or whether it's a deeper source, an inner knowing which is being revealed because some kind of layer of obscuration is being removed and you can hear your own inner wisdom more clearly. Or somewhere in between the two. I don't attempt to analyze it beyond that because I'm still learning and still open to many, many different aspects of this whole experience. But a lot of the songs that I received towards the beginning of this journey of receiving songs were in Portuguese. And I didn't speak Portuguese. I didn't really even understand it. I had a basic understanding, or singing all the songs I would basically follow, how to decipher them, but then these songs are coming through me in this way. And I came to understand that it's one of the functions of taking part in these kinds of ceremonies, not that everybody is receiving songs, but there's a kind of commonality in and again, there's direct parallels here to Buddhist practice. When you meditate, the basic intention is to get out of the way. And to the extent that you still have a mind, it becomes a witnessing mind. So whatever you're feeling or thinking, you learn to detach from that and allow thoughts and feelings to rise and fall rather than follow them and feed them. And a similar thing in medicine, practices. And rather than amplifying the sense of our personal narrative with who we think we are and what we're doing, we practice to get out of the way something so something else can express itself through us, make itself known. And that seemed to be the function of these signs, that they were expressing teachings that had almost like a kind of urgency to be heard. And so the next question that I started to ask myself was, well, if these teachings are coming from spirit, and spirit is this non-human abstract quality, which is independent of culture, time, place, why would there be Portuguese words or English words, and why would they use these particular notes of this scale, which is a human invention, after all? Because although Pythagoras' word with certain intervals and certain mathematical proportions of sound, the actual scales themselves are human invention, because that's why you have different scales in the Balinese culture and different ones in Indian music and different ones in African music. The scales, the intervals are, so if I give you an example, if I play this note, that's the note E. If I play this note, that's also the note E, one octave higher. Now, how you fill in that space is open to interpretation. There are two key intervals between those two notes, between the low E and the high E. So there's two intervals. One is the fourth, which is this note. The other is the fifth, which is this note. And you'd be familiar with these two notes as forming the foundation of the drone, which might be used in Indian singing. So these notes, the fifth and the fourth and the octave, those are the notes that follow the sort of mathematical proportions of the laws of harmonics. But how you fill those notes in between is very open to interpretation. That's why you get very, very different scales and different cultures. The scale is a way of filling in the notes between the lower octave and the higher octave. And so I was very aware that these melodies are coming to me with this very particular form. Now, the melodies of Mestre Leo's Hinari, his songbook, they fall within a very, very simple diatonic Western understanding of scales and harmony, which I could understand culturally came from him through the music that he probably grew up with, because they're all forced to go to church and listen to Christian songs and hymns. And this is very similar kind of European Western harmonic language. But then I had this kind of epiphany one day when my understanding kind of opened up. I had a deeper realization. Because I'd always been interested in so many different kinds of music. And there's not much in common between a symphony by Gustav Mahler and a piece by Miles Davis, a jazz piece. The same basic notes are being used, but they're worlds apart. Well, one day inside a ceremony, when I was in the process of receiving the song, I had this kind of vision or this understanding that all the music was coming from the same place. I saw it visually as a kind of, like a stream of notes, like a kind of fountain or a cascade coming down from some place high up in some high elevation. And as it was streaming down, it landed in human consciousness at different places and times and took on the form of that being, according to my cultural conditioning. I saw Bach in his study with his quill pen, writing out his cantatas. I saw Miles Davis at some jazz bar in New York receiving his melodies. I saw all the different forms of music in their different cultural expressions as all being filtered through the culture and yet coming from the same source. And then I could see so clearly that the spirit from which all this music is arising is independent of any individual human manifestation, time or space. It has its own, it's almost like a kind of interface between the pure cosmic expression of source intelligence with human intelligence, at which point it sort of manifested to a cultural artifact and becomes a piece of music. And yet you can track it back to some fundamental source, which contains all the music and contains all the knowledge and wisdom as well. And so at that point, I stopped trying to understand why I was receiving these songs or where they were coming from, because it clearly was simply an expression of who I was at this point in time, what I was doing, and the fact I was able to open myself up to this source. And so my understanding about music started to shift a little bit and change at that point in time. Understanding of how to make myself available to source. And I think that a lot of the great composers, that's what they were doing. When I was younger, I really wanted to be I didn't want to be a great composer. I wanted to be a composer. I wanted to be able to write orchestral music like all these amazing pieces that I was listening to. Could never quite get there. And yet with these very, very simple songs, I got there. I got to that place where I could just open myself to connect to source. And then in hindsight, I could see that's exactly what Beethoven and Bach were doing, but just in a much more sophisticated way. And it's what Miles Davis is doing when he's improvising, his incredible solos on the trumpet. And all of the music is coming, and probably Paul McCartney's song Yesterday as well. It doesn't mean that if you track yourself back to source, all those songs are going to be sitting there together, because as they filter down, it's almost like they accrue cultural flavors and textures to become the ultimate manifestation in a particular place and time. So there is a unique feature about medicine songs in the way that they are considered to be channeled rather than composed. But there is also something that connects on a deeper level to the initial impulse to create music, and that how it allows one to connect to source, which could be another version of what we were saying at the beginning about how music is a bridge from the sea to the inner sea, from the head to be source of here.
It's interesting you mentioned Bach, because I believe he has a whole opus or musical score, an ode to tobacco, which it's...
And really, I had no idea about that. Really. It's fascinating.
When this is happening, whether it's in a medicine space using a plant like tobacco, ayahuasca, I mean, you look at a lot of African traditions, and like the Bwiti tradition or the Pygmy traditions who are working with Iboga are also receiving, channeling a lot of very specific music and very, very specific to that work, to their culture or context. I mean, it was for me, very fascinating, because I haven't studied music. I wouldn't say I have a deep connection to music. But for example, when I was working with Iboga, it was very clear to me that music was very specific to that medicine. It was this very, I don't know if you've ever listened to any of that music, but it's very repetitive, and it was very fascinating, because when I was in that space, when I was very open, and again, this could just be my imagination, but it felt to me like the music was literally putting my brain in a certain pattern that forced it to go into a very specific place that the medicine, the intelligence of that medicine wanted me to go. And it was very difficult. It was a very trying experience. And even that ceremony, it's called the ceremony of death, the death ceremony. And it was very fascinating, because I remember very clearly when the music changed, there was a very particular moment when the cadence changed, when the feeling, but the music changed. This revelation happened that put me in a completely different space. And so, I mean, this is kind of maybe a tangential subject, but it's where I find very interesting, because certainly these alkaloids or these derivatives of kinds like ibogaine, I think can be worked with them in very powerful ways. And I think there's a lot of research that backs that up. But I don't know how you create that experience of not only working with the whole plant in all of its complexity, and even things like ayahuasca, I think often, unfortunately, boil down to something very simple like dimethyltryptamine. But there's all sorts of alkaloids in that ayahuasca brew, harm alkaloids, and all sorts of things that give it a synergistic effect. But for me, that music was very, very vital to that experience. From your understanding as a musician, because I think it's interesting, like, I have seen people, I mean, even myself, I don't think I have a deep connection to music. And even as I began to do the work I was doing, it was a bit scary in the sense that I wasn't singing, I wasn't musically applying, and yet the traditions that I was working with, they often put a big emphasis on singing this aspect of the song. And things didn't come to me until one time I was doing a dieta, and it wasn't the first dieta I'd done, right? I'd done a number of things. And I was sitting in my little tondo, my little hut in this Shipibo village, on the outskirts of the Shipibo village. And I started to hear this flute, and it was very short and very repetitive. And in the beginning, I just assumed, well, there must be someone playing the flute nearby. And yet at the same time, my logical mind was thinking, well, that's strange because I don't know any Shipibo people, and especially in this village, who play flute players, which is in general not something that happens. I hadn't seen any other foreigners, and it was a very small place. So I was very confused, like, where's this flute coming from? But still my logical mind was saying, okay, well, there must be someone playing a flute. But then as the minutes went by, the hours went by, I couldn't explain it, because one, who would be playing for that long, and who would just be playing this repetition over and over, almost to the point where it was driving me mad, because even when I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake it. It was just that it was there. It was in my consciousness. It was, I felt like in my brain, until I was kind of forced to go against my logical mind and say, I don't think this is coming from something in this Rihanna. That there was something that was being channeled. And as I began to open that idea, I started to sing along to it, or to hum along to it. And it was just sound. There was no words there. And eventually, as time went by, I began to kind of organically add words to that melody, and that melody became a song. But I guess what my question is, it's not something that everyone experiences when they go to a ceremony, that they receive songs. And I would imagine, being a musician, one would be more inclined to receive songs, because that's also part of who you are. Any musician, that's part of maybe their role in this reality. Do you think that that's something that we all, as individuals, we all have our roles, and that is our role for some people, and for some people it's not? Or do you see that is something maybe primordial, that is something, whether we desire it, or we're open to it, that is a possibility in these medicine spaces, that's something that can come through? And there may be various blocks or conditioning or whatever, or it's not just our role, but that is a potentiality for everyone, or is more specific to someone who that is the
I think the answer is somewhere in between the two. I wouldn't say it's primordial in the sense that everybody has this capacity, but neither would I say it's related or is only available to musicians. In fact, quite the opposite, because most of the musicians that I know in ceremonies, they don't have their own songbooks, even though they're very accomplished musicians. And most of the people in the Santo Daime, which is Daime in Brazil, who had their own songs, they were simple people who were not playing musical instruments, were living in the forest and tending their daily life in simple ways and receiving solace. And in my work as a music teacher, I opened up a few years ago, I opened up some music classes with the members of my community. Initially, people wanted to learn my songs. And so I started these groups. It's an online session. We all meet in a Zoom room. And I've been doing it for about 5 years now. And I've had many students who are all members of our pool coming in and out of that, with those sessions over the years, and some have stayed. And it's really surprising the number of people who've started to receive their own songs during that process. And a lot of them picked up the guitar for the first time. Some of them had some basic skills, knew a few chords. And yet the process of learning my songs and tuning into the music has opened up their own musicality. And it can be one of the most powerful things, not only to receive your songs, but simply to say. The collective act of singing in the works, the trabalhos and the ceremonies, creates very powerful energy, because inside one of these medicine ceremonies, the expectation is that each person is going to be focused on their own experience. You don't engage with the person sitting next to you, the person behind you, or in front of you. You're there, and it's a very precious opportunity in the life that we lead to be given this permission to just focus on our own inner landscape and our own inner transformative process for a few hours. That's one of the reasons people are drawn to stems like you wander to a Vipassana groove and do a meditation retreat. And so there is this emphasis on the individual very much being there focused on the intention to do their work. And yet you're in a group, but everybody's singing together. This collective energy of the voices is very powerful. And many people have said to me that they never signed with fear, or they were told when they were young couldn't sing, and they discovered their voices inside the session. So even before we get to receiving chanting songs, just the act of singing can be very powerfully liberating and healing for people. And the act of singing is also very good physiological for us, because it stimulates this area, the body, the heart, chest, helps us to get some kind of flow going inside that we wouldn't have if we were sitting silently. So singing is very good on many levels. And then the channeling of the songs, or the receiving of the songs, I would not say it's limited to musicians or to people who have some preordained natural tendency. I think it's somewhere in between. I think it's anybody can have this experience if you allow yourself to open to it, and if you put yourself in a context where the possibility arises. And there's a lot to do with trust and faith that you can actually give yourself permission to have this experience, I suppose. It's also quite a kind of it's a narrow path in, because some people might have the desire from the ego to be someone who's receiving songs or chanting songs. In my case, it wasn't something I was looking for, or something I asked for, or something I expected. They never go looking for these songs. They just appear when they're ready. But there may be some people who wish to have that accolade, so they try writing some songs. And, it's the same in some medicine communities where some people have the gift to incorporate spirits. I've been in communities in Brazil where there's a kind of mediumistic aspect to the works, and some people in the community are known, out of a group of 40, 50 people, it could just be 2 or 3 people are acknowledged as having this gift in incorporating spirits during the ceremony. And it's not like everybody around them is training to do the same thing. Some people are good at cooking the food, some people are good at cooking the music, and some people incorporate the spirits. And as these medicines start to travel around the lost world, sometimes the lines become a little bit blurred between what somebody wants to do, as they'd like to have that experience, of what is naturally arising. So I'm very vigilant with myself, of not to judge another person, but just be observant and then be subcautious in my own process as a trained proposer, not to wish to kind of corrupt the purity of the channel by bouncing no ideas on how to say a melody should go. Sometimes I receive songs right in the heart of the ceremony, just fully formed. All the words in the melody just appear plop like that. Other times a melody stays with me for a few weeks, just kind of going out around in my head, and then one day the words will just arrive. On a few occasions I've had the rather challenging experience of being in the process of singing another song while the song arrives inside my head. I'm trying to listen to that whilst playing another song. And sometimes outside of ceremony, when I'm just in nature or lying in my bed at night, sitting quietly, when songs might arrive as well. But I have a kind of process, sort of quality control process, if you like. I don't write down everything or record everything. I wait to see if something really sacred. For example, if I hear a song in the ceremony or in the space immediately after the ceremony, I won't record it or write it down. I'll wait to see if I remember it in the morning. And if I do, then I take it more seriously. Otherwise, there's little fragments here, there, and really over the close. And the nature of the songs also changes from culture to culture, from tradition to tradition. You mentioned about the Bhuti music. I'm not familiar with that as a performer or as a participant in those ceremonies, but I'm familiar with the music. As a friend of mine that I collaborate with on other projects, he's a Bhuti musician. And what I've noticed in that music is all of the focus and the magic is on the polyrhythms. And so polyrhythm is where you get more than one rhythm played at once, and it creates this sort of shifting, strange kind of like rhythmical world where you're not quite sure where the beat is. So I'll give you a quick example. If I just sort of clap a rhythm like that, that's in 3 times, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And then you could sing it. You could sing many melodies to that, and it would be understood that's a tune in 3 time. And this is a very different rhythm. 1, 2, 1, 2. It's a very different rhythm. Now, if I play both these together, so we go. Whilst that 3 is going, I introduce the 2 at the same time. So now you have a polyrhythm, 3 and 2 playing at the same time. That's a very simple polyrhythm. The Bhuti music uses extremely sophisticated polyrhythms, shifting. It's like if you were to, a visual analogy might be when you're watching a movie and the camera is focused on one of the actors' faces close up, and so the background is blurred. And then the lens focus changes so that the person's face becomes blurred and the background comes into focus. And so if you imagine in a musical setting, it's a similar thing where at a certain point you think the beat's here, then it shifts and it's somewhere else. So British music is very much emphasizing this, and it becomes magical. And as you say, it accesses a certain kind of brain, and it encourages or invites you or leads you to a certain kind of place. And it breaks down also some normal kind of processing power in the brain, because you're used to hearing things in a certain way and you're being presented with different material, which has a kind of hypnotic effect and also leads you to a place that you might otherwise not get to because of this. And then in the Daime culture and in the indigenous Brazilian cultures of the Huniquin and the Yawanawa, the music is very different, not necessarily because of the melodies or the chordal structures, which have similarities, but because of the words and the intention of the words. I'm not very familiar with Yawanawa music, but I have some close friends who are. And then when they sing the songs and they translate them for me, they seem to be all about very close-up experiences with nature. Like this song is about that particular color you get just while before the sun is setting. This song is about the flight of the hummingbird. This song is about the opening of a flower. This song is about the movement of a snake. This song is about how ants build and bear nests. A very specific observations of nature. And that has the function of drawing you into the world of nature, giving you this very deep, close-up experience of what nature's doing outside of our own human experience. Whereas in the Santo Daime, the songs tend to have teachings that are more about how to be in community, how to treat their brothers and sisters, how to awaken your conscience, how to embody love and truth in your life. And so there's a very different kind of impulse that lies behind the offering, the receiving and the offering of the song for the community at large. And in my own case, the songs that I've received, they sort of tend to blend the teach the wisdom traditions of the East with elements of nature arising from experiences in the forest, and then my own teachings that I'm receiving from my own personal healing become woven into these images of nature, all these wisdom teachings from the bodhisattvas, together with instructions about how to live my life. I can sing you a song if you like. Sure. I was singing my newest song, which I just received a couple of weeks ago. I never know when the songs are coming. Sometimes there's a 1 year gap between, and other times 3 or 4 might arrive in the space for a couple of weeks. In the case of this song, I didn't hear any songs or receive any new songs since September last year. And then 2 weeks ago, I made a ceremony, and in the quiet place, in the middle of the ceremony, when everything suddenly went silent and stayed silent for a while, I heard this song just arrived. And I had the melody buzzing around inside me for quite some time, but with no words. And then the words just kind of popped into place. And this song is a really good illustration of what I was saying about the material and how it contains these different kind of cultural references. Because this song contains a reference to Iemanjá, who's from the Yoruba, Afro-Brazilian spiritual tradition, the Queen of the Oceans, who represents qualities of cleansing and purification. And then it also references Kali Ma from the Hindu tradition, who's the great mother also of purification, that whereas Iemanjá is associated with a kind of softness, and of course the ocean can be powerful and overwhelming, but Iemanjá is generally considered as something not so intimidating, more approachable, more soothing, comforting, embracing, whereas Kali Ma appears garlanded with skulls and her eyes blazing with fire, and she's there to rip down the walls of illusion so that the truth is revealed uncompromisingly in a moment rather than through some gentle step-by-step process. So this song mentions in the first verse the Queen of the Forest, which in Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese is Rainha da Floresta, which is a commonly understood way of personalizing the force of the ayahuasca, Rainha da Floresta. And so all these things, the Rainha da Floresta, the Iemanjá, and the Kali Ma, are all wrapped up in this song, together with images of being in ceremony, incense burning, and people singing songs. And then it finishes with the Kali mantra. This is hot off the press. beautiful, Adrian. This song seems to be more or less a perfect expression of where we might arrive at if an English guy spends time in Japan and India and Brazil and starts receiving songs.
That is beautiful. We're coming up on almost 3 hours.
Wow.
One question that I'd also like to ask, I saw a video before we started that I think you did with Ice Ears, and I'm quite close with some of the guys and women from Ice Ears, and I didn't know this about you, but that essentially the nature of the talk was, because Ice Ears is an organization similar to MAPS, which is working for the legalization of a lot of these sacred medicines that I think when you were in England, you were doing ceremony and you had a big case come against you that eventually you overcame and you gave a talk. Can you share a bit about that? Because as you said, we live in very interesting times, and I think there is, much as you said, again, depending on whatever our cosmovision is, but a bigger force and intelligence that's bringing these medicines out for the benefit of humanity, of the earth, of all of life. And at the same time, we're having to go through something that seemingly seems to be breaking down, but this kind of prohibition, this making illegal, which is quite strange even on a very basic level, that man could make something illegal that is of the earth, and something that's very old. And we often speak of these plants or these traditions as something very foreign to us that usually exists somewhere else, but I think we're not far from a day where we realize that this was really at the root of all culture around the world, of all traditions around the world. And that a big part of our suffering is because we've become very disconnected to that. This guy who I mentioned to you, Amika, the two Buddha, they have a beautiful story that, that they're often speaking about thousands of years or even eons ago, that also humanity was suffering. And, I think it gives a lot of credence to these ideas of Buddhism. Or, we often think that we're in, it's the nature of the ego that we think that no one else can understand us, or we're living in a time of suffering that no one has experienced before. But even from this very traditional Amazonian story, they say that even a long, long time ago, humans were suffering, and that these medicines were actually gifts from spirit. And they would actually say it can be star beings, interestingly, very specifically from the star system Sirius, and that on this primordial anaconda canoe, these star beings transcended the 12 dimensions of time and space, and on this canoe they brought with them all of these sacred plants to ease the suffering of humanity. And essentially at the root, humanity was suffering because we had forgotten who we are and where they come from. And so these plants were a way to help us to remember that. And I think in that way, there's this idea that these are very fundamental parts of the human experience. And even as you said, sometimes I think it can be difficult, maybe, and it's not to put things on a pedestal, because I think that's very dangerous too, but that when someone does have an experience via one of these traditions, via one of these plants or these medicine powers, their cosmology does open to a different way of seeing. Even that idea of traveling between worlds, something about that is not so strange or not so foreign, that it's a lived experience. And so going back to your story, this idea of also very much in this life having to struggle with these outside forces that ultimately they're trying to put you in a cage and keep you from not only being able to do your own practice, but I think, as you said, ultimately, as we begin to do these practices, part of that duty or that natural progression is to share, to spread. Can you speak about what that experience, one, what it was, and then what that was like for you, and maybe what you learned from that?
Well, there's a kind of inevitability to the way that the authorities attempt to crack down and stamp out these activities, because the kinds of awakenings and understandings, realizations and liberations that they're leading people to, if and when such understandings become general, then the existing power structure would naturally crumble. And a different kind of understanding of power, a non-abusive power, a power that's truly aligned with our potential as loving, expressive, collaborative beings would emerge. And I'm certain it will emerge at one point, whether it's in my lifetime or not, I can't say. All the work we're doing now is for generations to come, as it's much for ourselves. And every ceremony that we make, every meditation session, every circle, every song we sing is one more seed being planted. Whether that will take 5 years, 10 years, 1,000 years, or 5,000 years to bloom is not for me to know. It's in the act of the planting and the faith that we have in the value of these teachings and these practices. And being attached to outcomes usually never ends well. So there's a kind of inevitability about this. Terence McKenna talks about this in his book Archaic Revival, about how all of the ancient civilizations that had spiritual practices at their core were linked to working with plant spirits. And this connection has been lost, and we're left with a kind of shell of the teachings. And through these practices now, which are emerging with ayahuasca and peyote, iboga and other medicines, there's threads of reconnection to these more ancient ways of integrating the relationship with our natural world and the power inherent within that, with our daily lives and our relations and thoughts and connections, is in process. And I mean, in my case, I was the kind of reason in the eyes of the authorities for the actions they took against me was because of the DMT molecule, the dimethyltryptamine molecule itself, which they have made illegal. And they had no awareness or understanding or a willingness to open themselves to a broader definition of what that might mean when it comes from the plant, when the plant is in a ceremony, when the ceremony is in a community, or when the community is engaged in a process of opening themselves to healthy practices which would benefit to all and sundry. That would have led to a very different set of understandings on their behalf, but they're locked into a very sort of fractalized perception of the world in which they live. But I suppose the key point, I'm not so sure if I want to go into the details of what happened to me in those years, but I'm happy to talk about the effect it had on me and the significance I feel it had. Because you mentioned about reconnection, about connecting to nature and to our, the topic of reconnection, reconnection. This is such a powerful and important theme in all the work we're doing. Reconnecting to nature, which can happen just somebody sitting by the side of the river or watching the sunset on a daily basis, but connecting more deeply to the inherent wisdom contained within the cycles of nature, within the impermanence and the interdependence of all the different aspects of nature. And reconnection to our ancestors, to our ancestral traditions, not only because they did beautiful sayings under the moonlight, waving feathers and shaking rattles, but because of all the pain that our ancestors carried and the burdens that we carry because of that pain being unprocessed. They drag it around with us like a sack of rocks, and being given opportunities to engaged with this directly. A lot of it, because you also mentioned about how the pain and the suffering that humanity seems to embody, it seems to be ancient, and it is ancient, because if you look at the most ancient teachings, the Bhagavad Gita is set on a battlefield. And when the Buddha had his enlightenment moment sitting under the Bodhi tree, the first noble truth he came to understand is suffering exists. And it's the inability to recognize that truth and the desire to push it away and have done with it, deny it and block it, that causes the more suffering and the layering of suffering. And but as the Lebanese poet Khalil Gibran said, your pain is the shell that encases your I'm not going to misquote him. There's a very beautiful section about the nature of pain in this book, The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. If I can't quote it word for word, I'm not going to attempt. Anyway, there's this idea that our pain encloses or encapsulates the keys for understanding. And the breaking of the shell allows you have to experience pain in order for something else to be born through that. And this is a very delicate topic, because you wouldn't wish suffering upon anybody. You wouldn't wish suffering on, you might wish it upon your worst enemy. I don't know, not in the Metabhavna tradition of loving kindness, you would note. But you wouldn't wish suffering upon another person, but you can't deny the fact that suffering is there all around us. And it seems to have this function of opening up the possibility to other kinds of understandings and truths. And that's why we willingly enter into a suffering environment in subtypes of spiritual practices, whether with or without medicine. And so the question is whether you could open yourself. As we said, does your suffering remain your enemy, or does it become your teacher? And if you can open yourself to the teachings within the suffering, a lot of people say that when their house broke down and they lost all their possessions, it was the best thing that ever happened to them. It doesn't mean that you would applaud someone who's a victim of sexual abuse and their whole life's been ruined as a result, and they can't leave the house. It's a very delicate topic. But when we internalize this question to our own reality and our own experience, our own life journey, there are always lessons to be learned if we're available for them. And so going back to this question of the legal trial that I faced, that we were spent on for 2 years, during which I was held under certain conditions, shall we say, I was forced to confront my activities with the medicine. Why am I doing this? Who am I to be doing this work? Why am I doing it? And it was like a process of very intense purification, crystallization of my intentions, my understandings, why I was working with the medicine. Any kind of doubts or ambiguities were washed away, or more likely ground away. It's a grinding process. Go through the legal system is like being ground down. And in my case, it was like there's an image in one of my songs where it says, I place myself inside your hands like a grain in a pestle and mortar. Reduce me to your fine white sands. I'm here to follow your orders. Take it all, take it all, take it all. Purify my soul. Take it all, take it all, take it all. I'm here to follow your call. Take the mistakes that I may have made through ignorance and pride, through willfulness, foolishness, ignorance, and take the mistakes that I may have made through ignorance and pride, through foolishness, willfulness, anger, greed, and lies. Take it all, take it all, take it all. Purify my soul. Take it all, take it all, take it all. I'm here to follow your call. Wash me clean in the deepest streams of the rivers of the divine soul. For I find that the time has arrived to align with the spirit of the divine core. Take it all, take it all, take it all. Purify my soul. And so this song kind of expresses something of the process I went through. It's like this, say diamonds are made under extreme pressure. And until then they remain as black soot and charcoal, which is the extreme opposite end of the diamond, but the same carbon material. And so I could say that something in my soul, something in my heart, something in my awareness, my conscience of what I was doing and why I was doing it was crystallized and aligned through this process. And so I came to see it as not something that I would wish to go through, not something that I would wish upon another person, but something that ultimately brought me a lot of gifts and a lot of understandings and a lot of strength and faith and alignment. And it's in a way, it's a kind of metaphor for what each individual passes through when they enter into some kind of practice which is arduous and yet is known to have beneficial end results. Whether it's a sun dance with the Lakota Indian tradition, or it's in the Vipassana tradition, when sit and meditate in silence for days or weeks on end, or whether it's a dieta, or whether it's a Zen session, or the Iboga Bwiti rituals where the participants have to give away their possessions and say goodbye to their family because they're not sure they're going to survive. So there is this association with arduous processes which we have to go through in order to get the fruits that otherwise would be available to us. And perhaps the whole of life could be seen in that way. Perhaps before we're incarnated in this body, we're in some other kind of blissful state, and then we kind of take on the burden of a human incarnation with all of its trials and tribulations so that we may meet the challenge of the fruits of higher consciousness and higher love for creativity and connection to nature and the dance of life in all its glory, which is available to us if we are willing to put ourselves in the path of the fire of Kali and the crushing waves of the Enerjar and the crushing weight of some of the challenges that come our way. And quite clearly not everybody is drawn to that pen of war. Quite clearly not everybody survives. They either do enter upon it either willingly or unwillingly. And yet there does seem to be a direction and movement towards purification, towards enlightenment, liberation, which I see in my lifetime. In this conflict and turbulence and madness continues unabated, and yet more and more people seem to be drawn towards a place of being able to, willing to consecrate tools, to develop the capacity to hold tools in their hands to consecrate their lives, whether it's a prayer or a psalm or a bathing in a river, take a part of the ceremony, or simply applying a certain kind of intention to how we choose to see things and interpret events, which can then bring light and healing into a relationship without needing to be anything beyond that, without needing to engage with divine powers. If we can bring some kind of enlightened perspective into our relationships, the world is already going to be a much better place. And the awareness that's brought through the Me Too movement and through Black Lives Matter and through more and more focus on individual rights for people from diverse backgrounds, minorities and groups that have been traditionally subject to a lot of discrimination and violence, and with the burning of all the witches and so many stories in our history that are now coming to light, and empowerment for individuals or groups is being made available in ways that would never have been possible before. And more young, I've just come through a festival, and the number of young people I saw that are bright, clear, and connected, and engaging themselves with spiritual practice, modesty practices, and all kinds of modalities of healing, self-healing and communal healing. It was very, very inspiring to see. So I look at my own life and where I've come from, my early years to where I am now, and I look at the people around me, and I may be in the minority, but as John Lennon said, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. And there's more and more of us that are understanding and recognizing the need to engage with these teachings which have ancient roots and a very contemporary relevance, and reconnection to ourselves, to our own hearts, retrieving lost parts of ourselves, helping others to do the same, cultivating compassion, patience, understanding, strength in the heart, and becoming responsible guardians and for these teachings which come our way, so they can be preserved and transmitted in a healthy form. And one of the most important lessons that I learned by sitting in thousands of ceremonies over the last 30 years is the ability and the capacity not to be distracted by what's going on around me. I also learned this through my Shakuhachi practice, because when I was in the heart of my Shakuhachi studies, I had kids. And then I find myself, my kids are clambering all over me like monkeys. And to hold a long note, the Shakuhachi. In ceremonies, the way the form this teaching comes is somebody behind you or in front of you on the other side of the room could be shouting or weeping or moaning or vomiting. But you don't allow yourself to be pulled into it. Stay connected to the thread of your own journey. And the capacity to do that in ceremony, which is a kind of training ground for these abilities, then becomes a tool or a resource that you can use in the outside world. And this is relevant in all kinds of daily situations, but it's also relevant in the very biggest picture, because a lot of the kind of madness that we see around us is wishing for us to be pulled into the vortex of turbulence in which we might lose hope, become infected with some kind of dark thoughts which can overwhelm us. And so the medicine ceremonies and all of the related spiritual practices, in one way, the sort of highest gift that they have to offer to us is the capacity to remain connected, but just to make that initial connection through a flash of insight and to remain connected to what is real and important. So when you can hold that as a thread through the various challenges that we face. And we go back to the three jewels of the Buddhist teachers. The Buddha simply means awareness. The Dharma is the teachings that we encounter. And the Sangha is our brothers and sisters that accompany us on the path. And so I do believe that we have all of those three resources in our rooms. And the way forward is not easy, but is available.
I think that's a beautiful way to end it. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming here, for taking time, for sharing your wisdom, sharing your story, things you learned along the way. I think you're doing beautiful work, and I really wish you the best. Well, thank you very much, Adrian. I appreciate it. Appreciate you and all you do, and thank you again.
Thank you for inviting me here. Your quality of listening is very has an almost sacred quality to it. It's been a pleasure to be in your company.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, everyone. That's it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. It was a pleasure for me to sit down and speak with and connect with Adrian. We went over 3 hours, which for me is always a really good sign of a deep conversation. And that's it. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's always a really big help to me. Patreon is a great website. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for. Those tiers also give you different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. As always, thank you very much to the people supporting that way. And if you're able to do that, thank you very much in advance. If you're interested in working with myself and my colleague Marav Artsy, when this is released, we will have one more plant dieta in the Sacred Valley of Peru, November 2nd to 30th. It's an amazing opportunity to go deeper into this work. If you'd like more information about that, you can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org. And then finally, as always, if you're able to support the algorithms, that's also a really big help. So if you're viewing this on YouTube or Rumble, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, and if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review. So that's it. I hope this finds you all well. Thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you all on the next episode.